Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. We're going to talk today about world reading, an earth-honoring, wisdom-seeking path built out of imagination, storytelling, and lore. To do that, I need to give you a little background on where this comes from and what led me to it. So it seems like for most of my life, I've been looking for life paths that lead to some kind of healing, wisdom, integration, consciousness, a sense of purpose. And I've pursued those down many different alleyways, some of which were satisfactory for the time. So, for example, I've been involved in psychology for about 2 decades now. At the master's level, marriage and family therapy. At the doctoral level, depth psychology, which has to do with how the conscious and the unconscious interact with each other, whether personal or on the collective level. I went to psychology like a lot of psychological practitioners do, out of a religious upbringing that I found unsatisfying. I was raised on the Christian side of the religious house in an institute that was not only hypocritical but scandal-ridden, and my own family suffered some abuse from this place, this church. So that was not a good impression to take with me to college. But even at that point, I realized that Christianity is not one giant thing, that there are many ways of doing it. And I continue to benefit from some of the things I learned about Christianity while I was a member of it. But there were so many things about it that didn't work for me and that still don't. The emphasis on obedience and authority, for instance, I think is just devastating. We see all the time the damage that does, even by people who are not Christians, but who have the famous excuse, I was just carrying out orders. The male imagery around the deity, the almost complete lack of feminine imagery about the deity, the titles like Lord, which always sound to me like medieval feudalism. And the emphasis on a one-size-fits-all spirituality in absolute literal belief, none of that worked for me. It never has. So I abandoned that fairly early. Psychology has served me well as a wisdom-seeking path, but it too has limitations. That old infection of seeking certainty, which I've talked a bit about in other podcasts, also infects psychology. In fact, one of the first things that happened when Carl Jung died was that a number of his followers started fighting with each other about who had the true Jungian way of doing things. So a split occurred right at the very beginning. Could have used a little reflection on how they were imitating what happens in religious circles. To this day, there is a lamentable dogmatism in Jungian psychology. Not everybody suffers from it. There are many practitioners who don't, but it's there. So that never felt good to me. I had a exchange with Edward Edinger, the senior analyst at the LA Institute, when he was still around, and I asked him a psychological question, and he basically said, you need to go into analysis and see the truth on our path, which just felt like missionary work to me. So he actually was very helpful in me deciding never to become a Jungian analyst. Another dissatisfying point about psychology is it tends to make everything about itself. There's a narcissism in it. And so when we reduce everything, for instance, to an archetype or an internal schema, to say it cognitively, or when everything's about your parents and how hurt you got when you were a kid, this is just debilitating, as psychologists themselves realized. Alfred Adler had a lot to say about this. So that never felt good to me either. There's a whole world of beauty and trouble out there, and to make it all about us just seems hopelessly out of date. So that didn't work either. I have tried different alternative spiritualities, some of which I liked very much. When they came from different cultures, though, I always felt a certain reluctance, and this was even before I understood cultural appropriation. Once I did, that ruled out a lot for me in terms of just making my own other people's practices. And then the path of philosophy, which I've been on for some time, more or less consciously, more consciously, I think, over the past year or so. And many good things in philosophy. I study it from all over the world. And, one of the things that doesn't work for me is this system building and this intellectualizing and abstract way of Western philosophy going about its business. That was actually one of the things that kept me from formally studying philosophy for as long as it has. I was in my 50s before I finally really started to gear up for that. And again, there are many exceptions to what I've just been saying. I'm thinking of Cornel West and his prophetic pragmatism. That's different. Freya Matthews and her participation and actually founding of what's now called the New Materialism, which takes matter seriously instead of just thinking of it as this kind of junk that we have to put up with, we spiritual beings, And there's other examples too, Merleau-Ponty. But even in his case, his writing is so hard to understand. And I think that was something that started with Hegel. I wish I could take a time machine back to Hegel or Kant, one of the two of them, and say, look, learn to write. Learn to write so that we can understand what you're telling us. There's no reason for this kind of language. It's just pompous. I have also thought a lot about and talked to people about the activism path. Our world is in deep trouble politically, environmentally, and in a lot of other ways, spiritually. And thought about that. I've worked with activists a lot. I actually helped fund them, not only out of my own pocket, but I worked for a street activist and artist funding organization for a while as a volunteer. I've given activists emotional support. I think what they do is really important. But the discourse, to use a philosophical word, that activism tends to engage in is really uninspiring for the most part. There's no visions of how things can be better. There's no ideals. There's no goals beyond pragmatic ones. It's interesting, too, to see how indigenous folks do activism compared to the rest of us. I'm thinking of Standing Rock and how the Sioux built ritual into it and celebration. That seems like a really great idea. And it's very effective, too, at mobilizing people. I also saw how sometimes activism descends into finger-pointing, blaming, and shaming, which doesn't convince anybody. I got enough of that growing up in the Christian church. So, where to go with all this? It took me a while to realize, but I actually have a sort of wisdom path of my own that I'm becoming more aware informs all the work that I've been doing my whole adult life and reaches back into childhood. And it's a path based on imagination. Among other things, there's other parts of it too, the body and involving that, and thought and reflection and so on. But what I didn't know until actually I began my depth psychology studies was that there is a path of imagination as a tool of wisdom, a capacity for wisdom. And, when a lot of us think of imagination, we think of just making stuff up, and how reliable is imagination compared to science and things like that. But it turns out that there's actually a deep tradition of a gnosis, a direct knowing through imagination. And the main representatives of this tradition, which I think is found in every culture, but I'm specifically focusing on the Hermetic aspect, which goes back to Alexandrian Egypt. The practitioners all through have distinguished between the kind of imagination that leads us astray and is toxic and unhealthy, and the kind that is a disciplined attempt to have greater contact with reality. This distinction appears in different words in the Corpus Hermeticum, which was published around the 3rd century, and based on lore that goes all the way back through Egyptian religion. And the distinction appears there, and Hermeticism spread throughout the world and took different forms, so the distinction appears in alchemy. Paracelsus eventually, down the line, distinguished true imagination from the false kind, vera imaginatio. It appears in the Romantic poets. Coleridge talks about this, Keats, other people. Early Romanticism, William Blake. Before him, Suwardi and Ibn Arabi, the great mystics of Islam and of later Sufi practice. So there's warnings about this all the way down the line. Goethe is another example. Wolfgang Goethe is known mainly as a playwright, but he was also a formidable science of phenomenon, science of actually using your senses, and he warns about this too. Parapsychology, which I named and practice with a whole group of people, talks about how we project things onto the places where we live and sometimes get confused. Parapsychology looks at how the things of the world, especially places, get into our psyche as presences. They're not just backdrops, and how our conflicts and complexes and also hopes and dreams reflect shifts in our environment. So it takes what eco-psychology and depth psychology started, and it goes in the direction of, okay, well, that's great for the natural world and looking at how our health depends on the health of the natural world, which is super important. But what about the built environment too? And then there's the whole question of how can our life path, whether we think of it as a philosophy that we live or a form of eco-spirituality or, in other terms, religion, whatever it is, how can our life path address the urgent needs of the world? And especially for those of us who are not heroic activists, who are quieter sorts of people who want to contribute in other ways. That has been a big question for me for a long time now. And with our heroes who get burned out or get injured, what can they do to continue to be effective at making change in the world? So one of my points of departure here is that what moves people, what moves me as well, is the kinds of stories, events, anecdotes, images, art, what have you, narrative, that inspires. That instead of pushing us from behind with shoulds and oughts and you need to do this to be saved or to save the world, instead gives us images of what we're moving toward or what we can build. How beautiful things can be, how inclusive we can be, how diverse. Show me. I want to see how it actually looks, and that will motivate me. Story in particular is particularly powerful that way, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts. There's plenty of examples of fictional tales that have made real changes in the world. One recent example, I think that Star Trek Discovery is doing more for the conversation around diversity than a million lectures about getting it right. And another word that's related to all this that you see come up in a lot of my work is enchantment. And by that, I don't mean descending into a blissful spell of disconnection. I mean being in active conversation with a world full of presences rather than objects. And sometimes the conversations are hard, but they're also magical. When you realize that you can, I was going to say walk outdoors, but it applies indoors as well, that the things around you are presences, that we're always in conversations with them. And obviously they don't speak like human beings, but as Merleau-Ponty and Goethe and a number of others have pointed out, everything has its own particular way of being in the world, of showing up, of interacting with us. And this brings us to world reading. What is it, and what's world read? And so for me, it's a lived, embodied philosophy, not in the abstract sense, but in the practical sense of engaging the imagination to be in the conversation of presences that's unfolding all around us. That's what world read is. It doesn't emphasize doctrines, dogmas, or absolute truth. It had nothing to do with any of those. It emphasizes experimentation, exploration, and play as a wisdom path. It says we can get farther with playing with ideas or practices than we can in trying to figure out which one of them is absolutely correct, and then shaming ourselves and each other in the process. As James Hillman pointed out, When you have an absolute standard of normality, then everything that falls outside of it perforce becomes deviant, right? There's just no need for that. There's no need for people telling us which books to read, which practices to engage in. Are we not adults? Can we not figure that out for ourselves? So I thought I would give you a couple of examples of world reading. When you look at my work, you'll see various spheres of it. So parapsychology is a big one. Also Enchantivism, which has to do with telling stories that move us forward through inspiration, rather than just you should do this and that. There's the deep study of ancestry, for instance, looking for the images and metaphors there in our past, in our families, looking at patterns that reverberate down the generations, which is something I became aware of when I practiced family therapy. And then we take up the project of Hermeticism and Transcendentalism, and we bring in maybe some myth. I'm thinking of W.E.B. Du Bois and his brilliant writing about Atlanta as a kind of Atalanta from Greek myth, but the myths can come from anywhere. And we ask ourselves, what are the stories that are playing out here? What are the mythic themes that captivate us? So let me give you a couple of examples of how to actually do this. So some years back, I was out walking. Wow, this was a while back as I think about it. And walking in the evening, which I like to do. And I was thinking about the kind of sustainable and even beyond that, earth appreciating society that I would like to be a part of. And I'm thinking about something that Kim Stanley Robinson said about how we don't even have basic rights to guarantee people. So how can we consider ourselves mature human beings? I'm loosely paraphrasing a comment that he made, and which is well taken. I'm imagining a society where not only the basic needs are met, and there's no poor people, and there's no power hierarchies and things like that, but a society that would be delightful to live in, that you would enjoy living in, that people would want to belong to. And of course, it would have to be highly diverse in many different ways, along many different dimensions. Diversity is where the creativity of the cosmos comes from, and on Earth, and in society. So we have to have that. We have to have basic needs met. We have to have productive work for people to do who wish to do it. And I'm not talking about utopia, which is impossible. I don't believe that we're built for utopia. I don't think the perfect society will ever exist for human beings, so long as we're human beings. But can't we do better than this? I think so. You read the news and it's so depressing. Do we really have to destroy our own planet? Do we really have to submit to fascist leaders? We can do way better than this. I'm convinced of it. You can see examples of that throughout human history. We're better than this. So as I'm pondering all this, and the word Terrania goes drifting through my mind as this kind of science fiction fantasy word, speculative fiction, for that kind of society that I'm imagining and that I know other people have imagined, I asked myself, well, what would be a way of moving toward that, that I would be interested in doing? And I had this thought right then that if I started to act like a Terranian, I started to act like somebody who lived in that sort of society, that might be one very modest step in helping a lot of us imagine it together and move forward. And as I had this thought, this gigantic meteor passed over my head, and it was so close, I heard a hissing sound from it. It was astounding. I've never had that happen before. Passed right over my head, and I was on the West Coast in California, so it was headed away from me toward the ocean, but I went, wow. So now Jungian psychology would call that a synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence. So something is going on with you internally, a thought, a dream, maybe a problem that you want to solve, and then the same thing gets paralleled externally. And this is a thought that comes up in many people's religions and spiritualities. It goes way back through the history of Hermeticism. The ancient Egyptians had a word for it. They called it Heka, which later got called sympathies and correspondences, and as above, so below, and alchemy. But it's this idea that inner and outer relate to each other meaningfully, even if we can't causally explain it. So we might stop with the Jungian explanation of synchronicity and just make it psychological, but world reading goes further. It says this seems to be an archetypal event, a collective event. So how might what just happened have something to tell me about my relationship with the collective? And because I was thinking about Earth as well, with my own planet. In fact, what if we thought of events like this not so much as synchronicities, although that's certainly one way to look at them, but more like gestures, more like meaningful communications from an intelligence that's not human, but that communicates in other ways, in nonverbal ways. It's a fantasy we can entertain. We don't have to prove it. I don't think it can be proved. But what if we lived as though that were the case? And that's where imagination comes into it. So through imagination, we reframe the issue into, what is Earth asking of me? What sort of work do I need to do? How do I move forward? Another point about this is that such events occur all the time, every day. We just tend not to notice them. Or if we do, if we've had some kind of a background in Jung, then we might say they're synchronicities and they're life lessons and so on and so forth. And we leave it at that, but we don't take the bigger step of, what is this saying about my relationship to place, nature, earth? How does that come into it? When you see this happen over and over and over and over again, and it happens in specific places, it really gets you wondering, to say it somewhat poetically and fancifully, what the place is trying to tell you. And that too is an ancient tradition, very ancient, goes very far back, probably in all our cultures. The idea that the landscape is animated, that there's something here. Maybe not some metaphysical presence or demon or daimon or whatever, but there's something about a place that networks into itself and emerges into itself so that it can communicate somehow. For me, world reading doesn't just involve reading the landscape like this in a kind of book of nature way, to use the Christian term, actually, that goes all the way back. Goethe called it the handwriting of God. But that's only part of it. Part of it, too, is adjusting how you live in the world. So, for instance, what's the story I tell myself about what my obligations are? Is it up to me to fix eco-anxiety and global warming? Probably not. I don't, for one thing, think I'm qualified to. But maybe I can tell myself and other people some stories that help us address those things in a meaningful way. Organic farmers say that if you feed the soil, the plants usually take care of themselves. And in the same way, there's an abundance of fixes and solutions out there, but what's lacking is the will to implement them. So if we can address that and have a good, inspiring effect on each other that way, then we can make some real progress. Another aspect to this is attempting to live more in alignment with the seasons and with the daily cycle of night and day. So I realize, because I've been there myself, that not all of us have the privilege to do that. We have tough jobs we have to work. We've got childcare responsibilities and things like that. So all of that interrupts what I'm talking about, and preempts it. But I've noticed over the years that the more I'm able to wake up when I want to wake up, and I usually wake up pretty damn early. My body says, wake up, get busy. I usually get up before the sun, or about when the sun does. And then when it goes down at night, I start winding down my activities. I do my best not to work in the evening. And seasonally, too, when I observe that in fall, I like to do things that are harvesting related, gather up my resources, gather up my messages if I'm teaching, that kind of thing. And then on toward winter, I begin to slow down and really become reflective and spend more time, sometimes outside being reflective, sometimes inside, but really settle down for the year. So where I have the opportunity to do those things, and I don't always, I find that I feel more at home in this world. I go outside and listen to all the conversations and insects, plants, animals, breezes, water, what have you. And I look up at the sky at night and I look at what the stars are doing. Things like that. And you can take this even farther. Eating seasonally is one thing. Understanding where your energy comes from, your water, where your waste goes, basic things like that. Another piece to this is watching our dreams and seeing how intimately they emphasize the connection between us and outer events and things that are happening in the world. My books talk a lot about this, especially parapsychological inquiry. So dream work from the standpoint not only of what's going on with me and my complexes, but how they're accurately mirroring what's happening outside and calling for some sort of creative response. One of the most exciting possibilities with world reading is, beyond its uses as a kind of personal, lived, imaginative philosophy, is the idea that a lot of us can get together, dream up the kind of world we want, and actually start moving toward it. And this can get us in touch with our yearnings and the yearnings of other like-minded people. So I think it was Saint Exupery who said, if you want people to learn to build boats, then don't teach them directly, just inspire their longing for the sea. So what kind of world do we long for? That's a world reading question. What kind of path of story and celebration, drama and film, movement and fiction can we dream up to help us along the way? This could give us not just philosophy, for instance, and it's certainly not religion. It can give us a lorosophy, a way of being in the world that's grounded in vision and dreaming together and using our imagination and inspirations for guidance. No absolute truths, books, creeds, authority figures. Just people on equal terms getting together to dream a better future, because the dreaming is the first necessary step toward getting there. If we can't imagine it, how can we go toward it? We live in a world with dire problems, but when we try to address those primarily through intellect and ego and planning, we neglect one of our greatest resources: imagination, collaborative imagination, where we dream together. Furthermore, Gnostics like Ibn Arabi talk about how intimately linked imagining is with the heart. And of course, not just the blood pump in the chest, but the imaginal heart, the center of personality, the place where everything lands emotionally. He refers to the heart as the chamber of images, which is beautiful. And in modern language, we would say the heart is where introversion and extroversion, outer and inner, alternate like heartbeats. So if we engage the imagination deeply and with good intentions, then we engage the heart as well. And we're certainly in need of more heartfulness in this world, not so much headfulness these days. Although reason and intellect obviously are important too. We need to come at these problems as whole people, heart-steadying together, and particularly in the unofficial conversations and the informal meetings we can be having with each other. Official channels are good for business as usual, but they don't tend to make for a whole lot of change from the bottom up. And some additional good news is that in complex systems as chaotic as our world-girdling society is now, even when things, and perhaps especially when things look dire on the surface, sometimes just a whisper, just a passion, just a fantasy that moves in the right direction can begin rewriting the entire system from the inside out. World Reading says, let's rewrite this system together. Thank you.